Hygiene had been a tricky thing at sea for most of history. All the way through the 1800s, most ships had no toilet facilities to speak of, not even for the crew. As such, passengers and crew alike regularly died on voyages, having succumbed to diseases such as typhus, also known as ship fever, caused by unsanitary conditions on board ship. It was common for ships to bury at sea multiple passengers during the course of a single voyage, something which was exacerbated by the slowness and relative unreliability of sailing ships and early steamships. By the turn of the century, this all started to change, due largely to increasing regulations on the shipping industry. But once it became more practical for ship owners to include more sanitation facilities on their ships, they were also pressured by the free market to install more toilets or water closets on their ships. Even steerage and third-class passengers valued their health and basic comfort enough to pay up for passage on a ship which afforded basic hygiene. Therefore, by the time the Olympic-class ships came into the picture, sanitation aboard ships was a much different thing than it had been just a decade or so earlier. On the Olympic-class ships, every person on board had ready access to what Americans, like myself, today call a toilet. This fact alone was demonstrative of Titanic's luxurious accommodations as they compared to earlier ships and even other ships of the same era. It does not mean, however, that every passenger had access to a private water closet. Quite the contrary, in fact. While most passenger cabins on Olympic and Titanic, except for third-class cabins intended for single men, included a private water basin, which is essentially a sink with running water from either a water tank or directly from the ship's water supply. The vast majority of passengers did not have access to private toilets. Even in the first class, the vast majority of passenger cabins did not have private water closets. In fact, this lack of private facilities was one of the reasons Olympic was forced into retirement. Standards in this arena had skyrocketed, and unfortunately, Olympic was built right in the middle of that change, and therefore was not as well equipped as ships built just a few years later. Even her younger sister, Titanic, had more private bathroom facilities. For the average passenger, relieving oneself involved finding a public water closet within your part of the ship, which, depending on where you were at the time, could require a long walk or even a trip to another deck of the ship. Olympic and Titanic were equipped with pedestal-type toilets, which, in terms of outward appearance, were remarkably similar to toilets ashore, and even to those we use today. These toilets include flushing mechanisms which, again, are not dissimilar from those we are used to. While there were many different mechanisms used at the time, those on Olympic and Titanic were of the lever type, which are very similar to something you might see in an outdated public restroom today, at least in the United States. All of the water closets aboard Olympic and Titanic flushed into soil pipes, which were emptied directly overboard, just above the waterline. For this, and about a million other reasons, Olympic and Titanic would be utterly unusable in today's regulatory environment. You might be wondering how much, if any, privacy was afforded to the users of the public facilities. And the answer is more than an American is used to in the 21st century. Individual toilets were separated from one another by way of wooden partitions secured to the deck. The doors of these stalls went all the way down. Why we don't do this in America today is utterly beyond me. Anyway, the stall doors on Olympic also included locks very similar to ones you might find on single-occupancy public bathrooms today, which indicate to the outside when the lock is engaged from the inside, signifying that the stall is in use. The pedestal toilets on the ship were made of lead-free glazed fire clay, and would have had a very familiar shine to them. The men's public lavatories also included urinals. When reading about history, I'm sometimes surprised by the similarities between how things used to be and how things are today. This is one of those times. Lavatories used by seamen and stokehold crew instead included urinal troughs, rather than standalone urinals, as enjoyed by the passengers. Each urinal incorporated a storm rail, so that a man would not have trouble standing if the seas were rough. It was a common problem for stewards in the third class to have to clean up after passengers who got up in the middle of the night and did not want to trek to the nearest lavatory, and thus found the nearest dark nook or cranny, of which there were many, and did his business there so as to get back to bed as quickly as possible. Those in first class had easier access to public lavatories, but one can imagine the relative luxury for those who had their own private water closets in their cabin or suite. In third class, though, some passengers did not even know how to use a modern water closet. This not only added to the problem of indiscriminate public urination on board, but also gave the third class stewards the less than desirable task of showing many passengers how to use the ship's facilities. A sign with instructions may have helped, but the third class carried many people who did not speak English. In summary, using the toilet aboard Olympic or Titanic was not as convenient as one would expect even a few years after those ships were built, and definitely not as convenient as one would expect today aboard a cruise ship, for example. But it was better than many people at the time would have even expected ashore. The most important thing was that there were plenty of places on board to go, and the facilities were modern and clean. This is more than could be said of ships only a few years earlier than 1911. But if you wanted to take a bath or a shower, that would have been a much more troublesome endeavor. But it could be accomplished for an extra fee.